Greetings, traveler. I am Nickelhypa. Welcome to my fourth and final Kefka critique. And yes, this one is the last one. For now. In my 3 previous videos, I took on some light and some middleweight pro-Kefka arguments from fans and critics who are actually fans disguised as critics. Just as I was about to call it a day and stop beating this dead horse, however, the horse not only came back to life but grew wings and took to the skies like Icarus. It's time to take on the heavyweight arguments for Kefka. The big guns are out, the gloves are off, the fat lady's about to sing, and other idioms as well. If you are anything like me and spend a considerable amount of your free time on Final Fantasy forums, fan groups, or YouTube comment sections, then you have most likely encountered a variant on the statement Kefka was a brilliant Machiavellian power schemer. I am almost never impressed by this claim, because most of the time fans throw it out there so casually and with no context or without even attempting to justify it with in-depth reasoning. It's just something that sounds good but has little substance. Imagine if a Sephiroth fan were to call Sephiroth a tragic Kierkegaardian fallen hero, or something akin to that. Most people would likely laugh at such an over-the-top expression of adoration and praise. And yet the claim that Kefka was a Machiavellian villain is rarely at the receiving end of scrutiny, let alone ridicule. So given that it is uncommon for fans of Kefka to explain or expand upon this statement, should we even take the claim so earnestly as to deconstruct and debunk it in a YouTube video? The answer is yes, we should, for 2 reasons. The first being that it will hopefully entertain and perhaps even enlighten us, and the second reason is this article on digitallydownloaded.net by Matt S. This is the author who brought out the big guns. Not only does Matt's article invoke Machiavelli's writings to praise Kefka, he also references 20th century French philosopher Paul-Michel Foucault and his ideas about the other to defend the proposition that Kefka is incredibly rational and his actions are rooted in deep wisdom. And yes, the author of the article actually says both of those things. Whenever one argues for or against a proposition, it is of utmost importance that they avoid misinterpreting and oversimplifying their opponent's arguments or taking anything out of context. For this reason, I invite all of my viewers to read Matt's article on Digitally Downloaded to get the full picture and to keep me on my toes. If I make any errors in this video essay, I hope my viewers catch those errors and force me to correct them. And speaking of correcting things, Matt S. says the following under the subheading Machiavelli on Kefka. Niccolo Machiavelli is a very misunderstood political philosopher. Too often, people read his defining work, The Prince, or more likely select quotes from it, and assume that he advocates for political leaders to be complete tyrants. Matt's accusation of such people is both correct and somewhat hypocritical or ironic. It's ironic or hypocritical because just a few paragraphs later, Matt boldly proclaims Machiavelli would have argued that a lot of what Kefka did in Final Fantasy VI was justified, if not outright moral. If we are to consider the misinterpreting of a political philosopher's writings because of ignorance condemnable, then I'd argue that putting words in the mouth of said political philosopher is equally condemnable, not to mention distasteful, because the philosopher in question is long dead and can no longer eloquently justify or clarify his own words. Unfortunately for Matt, I have read The Prince in its entirety at least 3 times, and it is one of my favorite philosophical or political writings of all time. And while my personal interpretation is that Machiavelli was a decent dude that would have hated Kefka, that interpretation is irrelevant. Most of the statements Matt makes in his segment Machiavelli on Kefka are demonstrably false in light of both Machiavelli's writings and the story of Final Fantasy VI itself. Little interpretation or none at all needed. I want to clarify that Matt's attempt to analyze and praise Kefka by using Machiavelli's and Foucault's ideas and concepts is itself a positive, admirable thing. It's just that the things he says in his article are so far from the reality of Kefka's in-game character and arc that the only thing the article achieves in my eyes is becoming the ultimate piece of evidence that Kefka is the most overrated villain in video games. Let's get to the actual analysis. We'll start like Matt does with Foucault. Unlike with Machiavelli, I possess only a bare minimum surface level knowledge of the philosophical ideas of Michel Foucault. I have read about him, watched videos on him, and I've seen his debates, and I find him quite interesting at points, but that's it. Lucky for me, Matt's mistakes in this area have to do with his misinterpretations of Final Fantasy VI and not Foucault. As far as I can tell, Matt's understanding of Foucault's idea of the other is correct. He's simply misapplying it when talking about Kefka, because he describes Kefka as much more impressive than Kefka actually is. I strongly recommend that you read Matt's entire article before continuing, but here's what he says in his Foucault on Kefka segment in a nutshell. 1. According to Foucault, society always needs an other, a group of people that share attributes that the rest of society can push out as diseased, separate from decent society, to be feared and point to as an example of wrongness. 2. Also according to Foucault, one subgroup of others in modern times are those who we generally label as insane. Prior to our modern era, madness was seen as a form of wisdom, and the insane would provide insights that normal people could not. 3. According to Matt, the previous points relate to Kefka because the experiments that drove Kefka insane were meant to drive knowledge into him. 4. According to Matt, Kefka's actions are rooted in a very deep level of wisdom indeed, one well beyond the comprehension of normal people. And finally, 5. Still according to Matt, Kefka's logic is not a logic that many would agree with, but in the spirit of philosophical debate, it's both rational and considered. Kefka's insanity, as per Foucault, is not so much insanity at all, but rather it's because we other him. The point of all these points, as I understand them, is to say that Kefka may be evil, but he's not insane. He's just a different kind of smart. He's wise. It's just that we, the so-called sane people, cannot accept his wisdom, because we don't like it. We don't like it, so we other him. The suggestion that Kefka is intelligent or cunning is something that I have already addressed many times in previous videos, by pointing out how his actions during the game contradict all ideas of him being intelligent or cunning. But what about wisdom in a philosophical context? What about the two famous quotes from Kefka that Matt also brings up in his article? Is there any wisdom in those? For those who don't remember, those quotes were: "Why do people insist on creating things that will inevitably be destroyed?" And "Why do people cling to life, knowing that they must someday die, knowing that none of it will have meant anything once they do?" I think Matt is wrong in saying that the Magitek experiments were supposed to give or did give Kefka superior knowledge. After all, Celes underwent the same experiments with more success according to the game's own words, and there's nothing in the game to show that Celes became an intellectual giant compared to the rest of FF6's characters. But beyond that, Kefka's nihilistic statements, and above all his response to the hero's response to those statements, are evidence of a shallow, not a deep mind. When Kefka asks his famous questions, the heroines and heroes of the game respond by naming the little and not so little things they value about life. To which Kefka responds with, "You sound like chapters from a self-help booklet." The irony here is that Kefka himself sounds like he's quoting a nihilism booklet written by a 14-year-old emo kid who read one quote that was probably misattributed to Nietzsche and found a justification for his teenage angst in said quote. Kefka's second question isn't just unimpressive, he bases it on faulty or absent logic. The question, why do people cling to life knowing that they must someday die, knowing that none of it will have meant anything once they do, relies on the assumption that only that which isn't temporal has value, or even that only eternal things can be enjoyable. And while the heroes don't directly state it, their responses do indirectly challenge that assumption, an assumption that Kefka hasn't even attempted to justify. When Kefka responds with, "You sound like chapters from a self-help booklet," it's funny, but there's no wisdom in that statement. His reply instead suggests that he hasn't thought things through and has no counter-argument to present. In the next moment, Kefka declares that he will destroy everything. Essentially, he threatens the heroes with further death and destruction, not with killer arguments that would shake their worldview or sense of purpose. Allow me to quote the late great Isaac Asimov, who once had one of his heroes from the Foundation trilogy say, "Violence is the last refuge of the incompetent." And before anyone declares that statement a half-truth or even a lie, allow me to point out that the quote is appropriate in the context of a philosophical debate. If one goes for violence, or the threat of violence for no reason other than that they don't have a good counter-argument, one fails to behave like a wise person. Towards the end of his article, Matt S. actually says the following: "Kefka is indeed a god, and the nature of faith is that we're meant to assume that divine beings are possessed of a wisdom beyond the comprehension of our limited minds. Remember, Kefka isn't really insane, so perhaps, just perhaps, his infinite wisdom means he's right." Well, I am sorry, Matt, but no, I will not just assume that Kefka is a wise villain with infinite wisdom and is right about how existence is meaningless. If the writers gave Kefka more development, if they gave Kefka better arguments for nihilism, if they gave us a look at how Kefka arrives at his conclusions, if they perhaps actually showed Kefka being othered and shunned, as opposed to showing him in a position of authority from the beginning, and if they did all those things well and with care, then maybe Kefka could have turned out as great as you think he is. That's not what we got with Kefka though. What we got was a shallow villain, whose arguments for existential nihilism don't stand up to scrutiny, and whose reasons for wanting to end everything for himself and everyone else were thus irrational. The idea of Kefka as the other that according to Foucault would provide insights that normal people could not is especially suspect because there's no insight in anything that Kefka says. His statements are the bare minimum of what could be considered philosophical statements, and his perspective is about as original as Ice Ice Baby's bassline and as intellectually stimulating as a Jaden Smith tweet. To conclude, the issue is not whether Kefka is insane or whether we consider him insane. The issue I have with Matt's line of reasoning is that everything that could be interesting about a villain that is othered is missing in Kefka. Now that the video is half over, let's get to the topic promised in the title. Allow me to refresh all our memories by quoting the relevant statement that Matt made once more. Machiavelli would have argued that a lot of what Kefka did in Final Fantasy VI was justified, if not outright moral. Like I already said, putting words in the mouth of a dead person is impudence in my eyes. But regardless, Matt is not the first or the last person to suggest that Kefka is in some way a smart Machiavellian villain. I would challenge that claim. If we should analyze a villain that gets most of his power by simply walking up to a statue and asking for magic power, in light of Machiavelli's writings at all, we should do so honestly, and look at the entirety of the advice Machiavelli gives to the ruler of Florence in his legendary work, The Prince. It's imperative for me to state that I am not looking only at Matt's article here. I am also responding to the more general claim that Kefka is a Machiavellian villain that many other fans make. I do not claim all the following points I criticize are a part of Matt's article. I think this is important for me to say to avoid accusations of the strawman fallacy. So, could we consider Kefka a Machiavellian villain at all? Let's look at some things good old Niccolo wrote. Here are a few quotes that Kefka fans might bring up to defend their position. Upon this, a question arises, whether it is better to be loved than feared, or feared than loved. It may be answered that one should wish to be both, but because it is difficult to unite them in one person, it is much safer to be feared than loved. One of the two, either, must be dispensed with. Men have less scruple in offending one who is beloved than one who is feared, and hatred is acquired as much by good works as by bad ones. Therefore, a prince wishing to keep his state is very often forced to do evil. So far so good for Kefka fans, you might think, right? Well, you'd think so, but you'd be mistaken. I spoke earlier about the importance of context, and it is the context of the entirety of The Prince that does not support the idea of Kefka being a clever Machiavellian power schemer. For example, in The Prince, Machiavelli emphasized repeatedly how important it is for a ruler to avoid being hated and despised by the people and by those close to him, claiming that a prince who doesn't offend those close to him shouldn't worry about conspiracies. He wrote, "Returning to the question of being feared or loved, I come to the conclusion that men loving according to their own will and fearing according to that of the prince, a wise prince should establish himself on that which is in his own control, and not in that of others. He must endeavor only to avoid hatred." He also wrote, "As princes cannot help being hated by someone, they ought in the first place to avoid being hated by everyone, and when they cannot accomplish this, they ought to endeavor with the utmost diligence to avoid the hatred of the most powerful." Even before committing genocide at Doma, Kefka is already despised and hated by his soldiers, as evidenced by in-game dialogue. He is therefore not Machiavellian in this area. On the contrary, he has behaved in ways that go against the advice of Machiavelli, by being a cruel, vile person. In fact, in The Prince, Machiavelli gives example after example of Roman emperors who were horrible individuals and often behaved in ways not unlike Kefka. Of the evil emperors that Machiavelli lists, all but one were betrayed and killed precisely because the people close to them despised them. This again makes sense, because as Machiavelli also wrote, "For this reason, I consider that a prince ought to reckon conspiracies of little account when his people hold him in esteem." But when it is hostile to him and bears hatred towards him, he ought to fear everything and everybody. And, therefore, the best fortress is to be found in the love of the people. For although you may have fortresses, they will not save you if you are hated by the people. Machiavelli wasn't contradicting himself in The Prince. It is clear from reading and analyzing the entirety of his treatise that he advocated for a prince to be firm and vigorous, but not cruel or barbaric, and for him to be feared only in the sense that nobody would want to become the prince's enemy. A prince hated and despised by the people and by his closest associates would always have to live in fear and would likely find a violent end sooner rather than later, as evidenced by examples that Machiavelli gave of horrible emperors. You may notice that this actually applies to Kefka. He ruined the world and killed countless people, something that the heroes couldn't forgive, so they returned to him and destroyed him. Had Kefka been a more Machiavellian villain, perhaps he could have ruled the world for all eternity. Machiavelli's writings also support a notion the trueness of which should be obvious anyway. Incompetence will get you into trouble. And yet, possibly excluding Doma's genocide, Kefka is a screw-up. He sends Terra across the planet into enemy territory, then cannot reclaim Terra and is outsmarted by Edgar at Figaro, and then fails again and loses his entire army in Narsh. Gestahl doesn't punish Kefka for his mistakes and keeps him in power, because the writers of the game say that's how it is. Not because Kefka is a smart, intelligent, competent, strong Machiavellian power schemer. Kefka's power always originates from an external source, from Gestahl, from Seed's experiments, or from the goddess statues. Regarding this, Machiavelli wrote, "Nothing can be so uncertain or unstable as fame or power not founded on its own strength." If the story of Final Fantasy VI, specifically Gestahl's behavior and personality, were consistent, Kefka would not just lose his power, but most likely his life. Gestahl was a psychopathic tyrant, so brutal and determined that he personally kidnapped Terra as a baby after having her parents killed, just to learn more about espers and magic. In a story that made sense, considering Machiavelli's writings, Gestahl would not have kept someone as unstable and incompetent as Kefka around at all. But what about Kefka's actions in Doma? Regarding the poisoning of Doma and if that was Machiavellian, the answer might be both yes and no. I lean towards no. Machiavelli did claim injuries ought to be done all at one time, so that, being tasted less, they offend less. Benefits ought to be given little by little, so that the flavor of them may last longer. And he who becomes master of a city accustomed to freedom and does not destroy it may expect to be destroyed by it. For in rebellion it has always the watchword of liberty and its ancient privileges as a rallying point, which neither time nor benefits will ever cause it to forget. Machiavelli can't be ventriloquized by me, but I doubt very much if he would have condoned genocide that resulted in the complete annihilation of a nation and also had the side effect of ruining the land's natural resources. What is there to gain from such action? One gains no new soldiers to conscript into the army, there are no common folk left to enslave or deport, and there are incredible complications in repopulating the area with people from your own nation because the land is inhabitable because of its ruined natural resources. Also, Machiavelli's statement that benefits ought to be given little by little explicitly implies that there are people to whom a ruler can give benefits. That's not the case with Doma, as Kefka exterminated the population down to the last child. Machiavelli also says that a ruler should delegate the instruments of punishment to others, and keep instruments of mercy in their own hands. While Machiavelli wasn't talking about war in this case, I'd still propose that if the genocide at Doma was unavoidable for victory, Kefka deciding to get his own hands dirty rather than having his soldiers deliver the poison was not Machiavellian, but was instead incredibly risky and stupid. If Kefka was truly clever, he might have ordered some of his soldiers to pour the poison at night or whenever Leo was asleep. He might never have gone to Doma in person at all or sent Leo away, and might even have blamed Leo as a scapegoat if the genocide failed and or backfired somehow. Think about it, just for 1 second. Imagine how much more evil and intelligent Kefka would have looked if he gave the orders, but organized it so Leo took the blame and the punishment. No such luck, Kefka was not well written enough for such a plotline. Let's get back to Matt's article. In it, Matt compares the poisoning of Doma to how the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs over Japanese cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, during World War II. Matt writes, America dropped nuclear bombs on civilian targets in Japan in World War II in a bid to hasten Japan's surrender. and save the death toll of a ground campaign onto Japanese soil. How is this different to poisoning a river to hasten a conquest? The answer is that it's not. It's the same thought process, the same result, and it was every bit as effective. Context, Matt. Context matters. If I began listing all the differences between the use of atomic bombs by the United States against Japan and Kefka killing an entire country with poison, we'd be here all night. And this has nothing to do with whether the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings were ethical or legal or whatever. I don't want to get into that debate in this video. I am talking about the historical, factual differences. I have read claims that Japan had already decided to surrender before United States dropped the bombs, which would of course make the bombings completely unforgivable no matter what. But I haven't looked into it myself. It's not relevant to this video. What is relevant is the fact that the atomic bombs were dropped as a demonstration of power. Poisoning a body of water is a demonstration of cruelty and dirty tactics, but not of power. And it shouldn't logically be a tactic that anyone would use against a state that they hope will surrender. Might such a move be made against a conquering army as a last resort of defending oneself? Sure, but not the other way round. Anyone can poison a river. There's not only no honor in such a course of action, there's also no recognizable power behind it. Such a move will backfire in the long run. If a tyrant or a country ruled by one can show their superior weaponry, that will be beneficial to that country and will surely assist in their endeavor to maintain their territory or annex more territory. Dirty tactics like poisoning a body of water that causes the death of everyone will only make sure that no one will trust you to play by the rules ever again. All the nations and rulers that are alerted to such actions will probably band together against your state to prevent or punish such atrocities in the future. And that's what happens. As poorly written and contrived as Final Fantasy VI's story often is, here things flow logically, and individuals from all nations, including Figaro, Doma, and eventually Narsh, unite their forces and cause Kefka to lose his entire army and run away. Kefka never stood a chance at Narsh, precisely because he committed genocide at Doma and attempted genocide at Figaro Castle. I am sorry, but there's no way that FF6's mad clown could be considered a wise Machiavellian dude. So no, Matt, Kefka's actions were not the result of the same thought process, did not have the same results, and could not have logically been as effective either. Instead, Kefka's actions have no justification, because they achieved nothing but the complete destruction of a self-made enemy that was no threat to the Gestalian Empire before Gestal began his conquest, and would have been no threat had the Empire themselves ceased to be hostile. That and his actions united the world against his country. Well done indeed. It's time to conclude this video, and this is going to be a rough landing, but I have no choice. The misinterpretations of Kefka and his arc by fans and critics, and the overhyping of his character and achievements in the story have gone so far that I feel the need to end things with the following illustration. Knowledge of the most practical, useful, and insightful philosophical writings of all time is like a collection of precious metals. When and if we shape those metals into useful tools for analyzing art, including video games and the characters within, I believe we are putting these precious metals into most excellent use. Philosophy can be very helpful in understanding and appreciating our favorite entertainment medium. However, while I appreciate the effort that has gone into writing this article, I think so much of it misinterprets and overpraises FF6's writing that the precious metals of philosophy have not been properly shaped into useful intellectual tools. Here, they have instead been melted down and then brushed onto Kefka in a turd polishing exercise. I see this happen a lot with Final Fantasy VI, especially regarding Kefka. In my eyes, his character and arc crumble under scrutiny and analysis, and when people do attempt to argue for the greatness of Kefka with their best, most cutting-edge, in-depth arguments, I observe that more often than not, they are arguing backwards from their conclusion, or, as Dr. Steven Novella puts it, the default mode of human psychology is to grab on to comforting beliefs for purely emotional reasons, and then justify those beliefs to ourselves with post hoc rationalizations. I'm sorry, Matt, I don't find your article convincing. Thank you for writing it though, as it gave me something to think about and to respond to. Kefka is still not a good villain. Thank you all for watching. May you never run out of coffee and cookies. Nickelhypa out. A video about Sephiroth being a Kierkegaardian villain coming sometime soon.